In the autumn of 1918, as the Great War staggered toward its bloody end, an unseen enemy emerged from the shadows. It moved silently, swiftly, and with terrifying efficiency. Within months, it would claim more lives than the 4 years of trench warfare combined. This was not a weapon of steel and fire, but something far smaller, far deadlier, an invisible killer that would rewrite the rules of survival itself. The first whispers of its arrival came in the spring of that year, though few paid them much mind. Soldiers in the crowded training camps of Kansas reported fevers, aching limbs, and a relentless cough. Army doctors dismissed it as just another strain of influenza, the common flu that had always been with us. But this was different. This was influenza as humanity had never known it. By the time the world took notice, it was already too late. The virus had boarded ships, hitched rides on trains, and slipped into cities on the breath of unsuspecting travelers. It swept through military bases, where young men lived shoulder to shoulder in cramped barracks, their immune systems weakened by the hardships of war. From there it leapt into civilian life, carried by soldiers returning home or by those who had come to see them off. No border could stop it. No wall could hold it back. What made this influenza so devastating was not just its speed, but its cruelty. Most strains of flu prey on the very young and the very old, the frail and the infirm. But this one had a chilling preference. It targeted the strong, the healthy, those in the prime of their lives, men and women between 20 and 40 years old. In a matter of days, vibrant, robust individuals would be struck down, their lungs filling with fluid, their skin turning a ghastly blue as their bodies fought for oxygen. Some died within hours of their first symptoms. Others lingered for days, gasping for air in overcrowded hospitals where doctors and nurses, themselves falling ill, could do little more than offer comfort. The numbers defy comprehension. In the United States alone, an estimated 675,000 people perished. In India, the death toll may have reached 17 million. Worldwide, the estimates vary, but most historians agree that at least 50 million people lost their lives. Some believe the true figure could be as high as 100 million. To put that into perspective, the First World War claimed around 20 million lives. The Spanish flu, as it came to be known, killed more people in a single year than the Black Death did in a century. But why Spanish flu? The name is a quirk of history, a misnomer born of wartime censorship. Spain, neutral during a war, had no reason to suppress news of the outbreak. When the virus struck King Alfonso XIII and much of his court, the Spanish press reported it freely. Meanwhile, in the warring nations, Britain, France, Germany, the United States, governments tightly controlled information, fearing that news of the epidemic would damage morale. So while the world read about the flu in Spain, the true scale of the crisis remained hidden. The name stuck, not because the virus originated there, but because Spain was the first to speak openly about it. Where the virus truly began is a question that has puzzled scientists for over a century. Some early theories pointed to a British army camp in Naples, France, where soldiers lived in squalid conditions alongside pigs and poultry, animals known to harbor influenza viruses. Others suggested it may have emerged in China, mutating as it traveled along trade routes. In recent years, researchers have uncovered evidence that the virus may have first jumped from birds to humans in Haskell County, Kansas, in early 1918. From there, it could have spread to nearby military camps before hitching a ride to Europe with American troops. But the truth is, we may never know for certain. The origins of the 1918 influenza remain one of history's most haunting mysteries. What we do know is that the virus was unlike anything the world had seen before. It came in waves, each more deadly than the last. The first wave, in the spring of 1918, was relatively mild. Many who fell ill recovered within a week, and the death rate was not unusually high. But the virus was not done. Over the summer, it mutated, evolving into a far more lethal form. When it returned in the autumn, it struck with terrifying force. In Philadelphia, a city of near 2 million people, the virus found fertile ground. Despite warnings from doctors, city officials proceeded with a massive wartime parade on September 28th, drawing hundreds of thousands of spectators into the streets. Within days, the hospitals were overwhelmed. Makeshift wards were set up in schools and churches, bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. In one particularly grim account, a priest driving a horse-drawn cart through the streets called out, "Bring out your dead," collecting corpses from doorsteps as families wept inside. The scene was repeated in cities across the globe. In Bombay, now Mumbai, funeral pyres burned day and night. In Rio de Janeiro, the dead were buried in mass graves. In Alaska, entire Inuit villages were wiped out, their populations too isolated to have built up any immunity. In Samoa, nearly a quarter of the population perished after a ship carrying the virus docked in November 1918. The world had never seen a catastrophe on this scale, and it was happening not in the distant past, but within living memory. Yet for all its horror, the Spanish flu left surprisingly few traces in the historical record. There were no grand memorials to its victims, no monuments to the millions who perished. In part, this was because the world was already reeling from the war. The flu was just another layer of tragedy in an era defined by suffering. But it was also because the virus struck so suddenly and disappeared almost as quickly. By the summer of 1919, the pandemic had burned itself out, leaving behind a stunned and grieving world. The response to the pandemic was hampered by the limited medical knowledge of the time. Scientists had only recently discovered viruses, and the idea that an invisible pathogen could cause such devastation was still new. Doctors prescribed aspirin in dangerously high doses, not yet understanding its toxic effects. Some cities imposed quarantines, closed schools, and banned public gatherings, but these measures were often too little, too late. Masks became a common sight, though their effectiveness was debated even then. In San Francisco, a man was fined for refusing to wear one in public. In other places, people flouted the rules, gathering in defiance of the warnings. The pandemic also exposed the deep inequalities of the time. The poor living in crowded tenements with little access to health care were far more likely to fall ill and die. In the United States, African American communities, already marginalized by segregation and racism, suffered disproportionately. Native American populations, particularly in the Southwest, were devastated. In some tribes, the death rate was 10 times higher than in the general population. The flu did not discriminate, but society did. As quickly as it had arrived, the virus seemed to vanish. By 1920, life had returned to a semblance of normalcy. The war was over, economies were recovering, and the memory of the pandemic began to fade. But the Spanish flu left a lasting legacy, one that would shape the course of public health forever. It was the first true test of the newly formed health organizations, like the League of Nations Health Organization, which would later evolve into the World Health Organization. It spurred advances in virology, epidemiology, and vaccine development. And it taught the world a harsh lesson, that in an age of global travel and interconnectedness, a disease in one corner of the world could become a crisis everywhere. Yet for all the progress made in the century since, the Spanish flu remains a cautionary tale. In 2009, when a new strain of H1N1 influenza emerged, scientists compared it to the 1918 virus and found striking similarities. The world had changed in countless ways, but the threat of a pandemic had not. The same factors that allowed the Spanish flu to spread, global travel, urbanization, misinformation, still exist today. And while modern medicine has given us tools that doctors in 1918 could only dream of, the fundamental challenge remains. How do we protect ourselves when the next invisible enemy emerges? The story of the Spanish flu is not just a story of death and suffering. It is also a story of resilience, of nurses working around the clock in overcrowded wards, of neighbors caring for one another when governments could not, of scientists racing to understand a virus that seemed to defy all logic, and of ordinary people, faced with an extraordinary crisis, finding the strength to endure. In the end, the Spanish flu faded from public memory, not because it was unimportant, but because the world was eager to move on. The war had ended, and with it, the collective trauma of an era. But the lessons of 1918 are as relevant today as they were a century ago. In a world that is more connected than ever, the next pandemic is not a question of if, but when. And when it comes, we will face the same choices that were made in 1918, to act swiftly, to act together, and to act with compassion. The Spanish flu was the silent killer that killed millions, but it was also a reminder of something else, that in the face of an invisible enemy, our greatest weapon is not just science but solidarity. The question is, when the next pandemic comes, will we be ready?